welcome to the archive, John. And
How
as
do you
Thor
do?
likes to say in the beginning of all of his videos,
Välkommen alla sammen.
Absolutely.
or as you say at the beginning of all of your videos, grab a cup of tea.
Yes. And how do you do? Yes. Pleasure to meet you and good to see you again, Garrett.
All right, so you are an Indo-European specialist, and even though the Skaldic archive is about things Norse, there are a lot of roots and things that trace back all the way to Indo-European times that we see in Norse.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get started with talking about at least roughly who the Indo-European were. Okay,
so the best place to start there is with the term Proto IndoEuropean, because that's where it sort of starts. And Proto IndoEuropean is actually representative of a language being spoken. And it's a language that we can only hypothesize as being that existed because no one speaks it anymore. But because we see traces of languages that have commonalities around the Indo-European landscape, we can make some academic decision-making to trace, and we can trace them all back using certain rules of grammar to a single source, and that single source is Proto-Indo-European. And the reason it's important, certainly for cultural development across India and Europe, is that because it spread everywhere, there must be something special about it. And what was special about it was the culture was very good at farming, very good at war. And so those two things together made it a very successful, expanding sort of empire of culture, rather than a sort of a large empire like the Roman Empire. It's just a lot of people who spread out. They had very good, relatively advanced ways which put them ahead of other cultures they came across, and they either took them over or merged with them. And we've got a lot of evidence of this, and we can tell when we approach the Nordic culture that there are myths within the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda that are very much Indo-European, i.e. that not only is the language spread across Indo-European and we can trace it back, but we have myths that are spread across the Indo-European landscape and we can trace them back to a single source. So we know the myths originated with the Proto-Indo-European speaking people. We know that the people who are telling those myths must have an Indo-European background. And then that is basically evidenced by DNA.
Okay. What a lot of people are going to know this, just for the people who are relatively new to the Indo-European stuff. What kind of time period are we going back to when all this originates? I mean, they know the Viking Age was 1,000 years ago, the Germanic tribes and the Romans 2,000-3,000 years ago. How, it's difficult to say, I know, but when would you say the time period we're looking back at this Proto-Indo-European language and culture?
Okay, so Indo-Europeans, I would say you're looking about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, but it's actually earlier than that, and we can see it's earlier than that for a couple of reasons. And we can talk about these in more detail, but in synopsis, we see agricultural mythology within the Nordic stories. So the creation myth of Old Norse, the Völuspá, where it talks about Ymir and Thumbla and Bor, is it Bor?
Bor.
Yeah.
That's a start.
That is an agricultural creation myth. And so that must come from the agricultural people of the Near East originally for it to filter in there. And I strongly believe the Vanir are a remnant of those agricultural gods that have been brought through into the Indo-European pantheon, what we would class as the Indo-European pantheon of the Essia gods. And so, yeah, so there is a pre sort of 4,000 or 5,000 year old migration in from the agricultural expansion. Then you've got the Indo-European expansion, and it's very early into the Nordic lands. And we know this because there is a dialect split called Kentum Satum split in Indo-European language, and the Kentum split headed up to Scandinavia, but it also went very eastwards into Asia. So there is the far expanse has this, and then we see another Satum sort of split of dialect then spread after that. And because we can see that split, we can say that there was an early migration of Indo-Europeans, which hit Scandinavia, and then there was a sort of a later migration after that. And so there are myths I can tell you about that again evidence that too.
Do you have another question, Thor?
No, that was it.
Oh, I
for
can
now.
tell you
Just,
some. Do you want to hear some of the myths then to tell you, or the
Yeah.
or why these things are like that? So
Yeah, let's go into the myths.
right. So I'll talk about two myths, then Indo-European myths that will explain or justify what I'm saying. So the first around the agricultural push into the Nordic culture. So we have, as I've mentioned, the creation myth, for example. So a thumbler, the cow, you see Ymir suckling on a thumbler. Okay, so Ymir's suckling the teat to get milk to keep him strong at the start of creation. Okay, now because Ymir's suckling the cow, and the cow isn't sacrificed to create the world, instead of Ymir is sacrificed to create the world, that is a very agricultural view of creation. What we find in the more pastoral farmers type myths, and Indo-Europeans were very much pastoral farmers, is that the cow's sacrificed to create crops and vegetation and animals. And we don't see that. So we see where the cow is used for suckling, that is an agricultural myth. Where the cow is chopped up and used to create something, that is a pastoral farming myth. And so that gives us a split between agricultural farmers and pastoral farmers. And so Proto IndoEuropeans and Indo-Europeans. And we also actually have another myth we can talk about, which is a Balder's Drumor. So Balder's Dream, you're familiar with that one, which is where Balder gets killed by Hothor, courtesy of Loki in the Eddas. And that myth actually reports back to Balder being an agricultural god, a key agricultural god. And we actually see hints of this through old Danish texts, Saxo Grammaticus, but also that falls into Osiris. It's very much a copy of the Egyptian Osiris myth. So, and what's that doing in Scandinavia? So, I mean, and that's because you've got that migration. So that's the agricultural myth. Then the older myth still is around the ferryman of the dead. So we actually see this split where the ferryman of the dead, and who's called Halon or Shalon or Kalon in Greek, depending on what part of Greek timeline you're talking about. We see stories of him going back about 30,000 years, because we see stories of him in the North American continent, as well as in Indo-European continent and elsewhere. But he actually appears in the prose Edda and the poetic Edda, in stories where you have a ferryman. I can't remember the poem. Thor comes across this ferryman, and the ferryman just has room for one in his boat, and you don't.
Oh yeah, Hardbarthjord, yeah.
Yeah, that's him. Yes, that's Hardbarth, because Hardbarth in effect means, I think, old man. I think, or there's a link to that, or
it's like a hidden Odin, like it's
well, yeah, you're meant to think
different...
it's Odin, but it is also very descriptive of ferryman. And there's and in the cattle raiding myth equivalent, so which is something else we talk about actually, which really is interesting. So the Thor and the Midgard serpent poem, where he visits Hymir, and I think there's an old man called Whitebeard within that. Whether that is Hymir or another man, but it's hinted at someone's really old and a white beard, and that is actually a direct link to Kalon or Kalon or Shalon, depending on what you want to call him, which is the ferryman of the dead. So we see this really old mythology again, still tied into the Nordic culture.
Yeah, that's what I would really want people to understand, like the parallels of these myths all over. And you just brought up three of them right there, but
there's more.
there's lots more. There's lots more. But those are kind of the three that have to deal with the agricultural side of things. I guess
there's
that's
pastoral
how you kind
one
of
as well. So we can know the Indo-Europeans. And the big pastoral one is the cattle raiding myth. So the cattle raiding myth. So it's quite an interesting myth. It's where in Proto-Indo-European days, they had a myth where a dragon came along and stole their cattle. Now, cattle were the most important thing to Indo-Europeans, because that proved your wealth. The more cattle you had, the wealthier you were. So it was a great offence if a cattle took your cow. So they have a myth where their warrior, Trito means third, he goes off, he basically sacrifices to a god, goes off, kills the dragon, and brings back the cattle. Okay, and then he then sacrifices the cattle to the gods, and you get this whole myth of how sacrifice works, as well as the cattle raiding myth, we call it, as well as the slaying of the dragon. Now, this is quite interesting because in Persia and in the Iranian mythology, because we're using poetry most of the time, and we use poetry back then because many things weren't written down, and poetry is far easier to remember. You can't always rhyme the words you want to use with other words, so you use other descriptions, metaphors, or kennings. We see them in Nordic poems, and so they started using these in Persia, and they used words that represented females who gave milk or females who lactate for cows. And this eventually went into India, and that got mistranslated into women because they thought, oh, a female gives milk, it must be a woman. And so the dragon or the cattle raiding myth involving a dragon turned into a knight rescuing princesses from a dragon, which then goes into the typical medieval story you see of St. George and the like. So that's how that story came along. However, when that earlier version of the story went into Scandinavia, and we see that in Thor and the Midgard serpent mythology. And what's happened is it's reflexed. So there's been a sort of a pivot of the story. And what you see is that as Thor turns up to Hymir's house, and Hymir obviously doesn't realize Thor is Thor because Thor's disguised as a young man, I think, or Hymir goes out fishing one day, and Thor wants to come along. And what Thor does is he kills Hymir's best cattle and uses the cattle head to get the dragon. Rather than kill the dragon to get the cattle, he kills the cattle to get the dragon. And that's a reflex of the Indo-European cattle raiding myth. In fact, that's the equivalent of a knight killing a dragon to get a princess. And so you really have a strong pastoral element there.
What do you think is the main driving? I've wondered this for many years, but I've never been able to figure it out or kind of come up with ideas. What do you think is the main driving reason why these myths changed? Why we eventually, if we go far back enough, it's traced to the same myths theoretically, and then different places, different times. The mythology, of course, is very similar everywhere, but there are certain differences. Do you think it's a matter of like the language and the rhyming, like you said, or is it more of a matter of the nature that's built the new myths and altered them to change in a way that they developed into?
Yeah, so it's primarily environmental changes. So the reason I study mythology is because it's far more powerful than people give it credit for. Because people just say, I'm a mythologist, people think I just tell fairy tales. But the thing is, Jack and the Beanstalk, told in Norwegian under the night sky by a fjord, with the northern lights going, is exactly the same as the Jack and the Beanstalk story told in the Amazon rainforest underneath the rainforest canopy and in the tribes there. That is the beauty of myth, irrespective of the language changing or the boundaries. The myth is nearly always the same, and that really allows us to trace it and use it as an incredible sort of tool aligned with DNA and archaeological evidence and their knowledge of human dispersals and cultural dispersal to track things. So that's why it's such a powerful tool and probably not so well understood. And we actually use something called phylogenetics. So it's almost like a genetic statistical modeling tool to map myths, because it's literally linked. It works very similar to how DNA works. DNA doesn't change rapidly, but you can see those changes. And it's very similar to that, is it? And DNA tends to change because there's been an environmental change, which has caused a particular group to take advantage of or supersede older groups or whatever. So that tends to be what happens. And many of those changes, I say the myths tend to stay the same, but maybe the people change. And that's really interesting. It's incredibly interesting actually for Scandinavian Nordic mythology, because, and I could be a bit controversial here, but I'll do it. So the original primordial beings of Indo-European mythology are Manu and Ymir. And Manu means man, and Yimo means twin. And we've got the warrior Trito, 3. So you see this mythology building up. Now Manu becomes the first priest who comes down to earth, and Yimo gets sacrificed, much like Ymir. So you have a complete, and Ymir is cognate with Yimo, it means twin. So, that the myth has travelled from Indo-European up to Scandinavia in that respect as well. So Manu sacrifices Yimo, and the world is created. And if we go up to the Nordic culture, we lose. Well, in fact, we lose pretty much every Indo-European name of a god and deity as we get to Scandinavia. It still persists in Greece and Rome and Eastern Europe, and partly into Germany. So Tacitus, when he wrote in Germania, he talked about Twisto, which means twin, aligned to Yimo and Ymir. And he also talks about Manu. And he also talks about how there are 3 tribes, and those 3 tribes actually relate to sort of Dumézil's consideration of classes, which relate to how Ymir was sacrificed in his body parts, which I can talk about the cosmogony, which underlines some of this stuff of the belief, because I think a lot of that is missing for people who want to understand Nordic religion a bit more. Understanding the cosmogony of Indo-Europeans will help that, because there's some really important lessons in there. But so we get to Scandinavia. So I've gone off about 15 different tangents. And all these people aren't there who are in the Indo-European myths. So what happened to them? And that is, so what is that cultural change? As you talk about what has changed in myths to make them different. And so the myths are the same, but just the names are different. And part of me thinks that Odin has replaced Manu, because Odin kills Ymir as Manu kills Yimo. And I actually think his title of Allfather is probably a mistranslation. So I'm not familiar if you're familiar with Jackson Crawford's work on the Allfather. So he mentioned about it being all-orderer. And actually, if it is all-orderer, that really aligns with Manu, who wants to keep the world in order through sacrifice, than it does to just being called an Allfather, which, as I say, doesn't seem to translate particularly well. So there you go. So environmental changes cause myths to change, but there haven't been many environmental changes to cause many myths to change. There's been the odd reflex you see, and you see that when there's been a clash of cultures, they often take the myth and then change it completely. That's done by the Abrahamic religions a lot. They take a lot of Indo-European myths and other myths and turn them around. But you say because most of the myths are still there hasn't been much of that. What we just see, I think, is just an overlap where you get the original shamanistic or animism type cultures in the Nordic areas replaced with agricultural people. They're replaced with the first wave of Indo-Europeans, the early Indo-Europeans, who are still a little agricultural focused, and then drifting in over time to get further Indo-Europeans and people from mainland Europe going up north. And I think you see some of that because of the adoption of the Odin and Thor and people into that pantheon. So
different types of gods for different types of gods being different, more important in different types of societies. The war gods are more important for war cultures, agriculture.
Exactly.
It all makes sense.
Exactly. And so as Roman Empire expands, you see the rise of Odin. Odin. Show me anyone who's mentioned Odin before 2,000 years ago. And he's not there. I mean, I can show you where he is, but he's not there, obviously. But when the Roman Empire expands, boom, he appears.
Yeah. It's all very difficult to with the written sources back then, especially in the north of Europe. There's almost none. But that leads into my next question, something I've been wondering about for a while, and everybody is going to want to know this too, by the way. What kind of sources could they go to if they wanted to? What are the main sources if they wanted to learn about the original Indo-European mythology and religion? Is it most of it reconstructed, or is there actual written sources going back 4,000 or 5,000 years like we spoke about?
Wow. Okay. So Indo-European is a big place. So there's no one book saying this is the Indo-European thing. It is reconstructed. And I would have to say, that most beliefs today that reflect on those older religions are reconstructed. I mean, I don't know any body who would be 100% confident that whatever they do is a total reconstruction of what was happening at the time. There's, you know, you can have gut feels that it probably is what was happening, but you can't be sure. Now, the oldest religious text we've got is the Rig Veda. That's about 3,500 years old. And then we can, you know, touch on the Zoroastrian text, the Yas, but that's over. I mean, that replaced the previous Indo-European culture, and what you see is Zoroaster try to, in effect, wipe out any Indo-European belief. But he has left clues in the text that there's obviously enough pushback to say, no, you can't get rid of Xanadu, for example. So rather than have a physical king like Chemo being sacrificed, it turns into a spirit of Xanadu. But and there's also mentions of twins in there in creation. So you still hint of it. But yeah, when you get to the Greek culture, that suffered a bit like the Nordic culture. In fact, you see multiple layers of agriculture, like the original people. Obviously, they weren't Greeks because there wasn't a place called Greece, but with the land mass Greece where people were on, I had to be specific because people always like to call me out. You see agriculture people go on there, and then one wave of Indo-Europeans through, you know, the Minoan society, and then another wave of Indo-Europeans later on coming from the north, replacing it. And you see this, and you know, just like you see in the Nordic myths, you can see in Greek myth, and certainly because there's a lot more writings in Greek from a lot earlier time, you can just, you know, see these gods not be on the same tier list. You see, like Demeter, who's obviously a mother goddess of the earth in the agricultural days, turns into someone on the side who, you know, isn't really part of the, well, she's not part of the Olympians, which seems really odd. So we haven't really answered your question yet. So where do you go for source? They say you can look at those texts, but it is really just reconstruction. So you have to go to academia and try and pull it together. And let's say we use mythology to help us understand things, so we can understand the cosmogony, which is really important in understanding religion. And there's a lot of work. I would recommend people like Bruce Lincoln. So he's got a book called Myth, Cosmos and Society, which is a really good book for the cosmogony. He's also got a book on Death, War and Sacrifice, which, like those two books together, you read those, you'll have a good understanding. Now, I'm not saying Bruce Lincoln is perfect, because there are things in there I don't necessarily agree with, but it gives you a really good starter for 10. And then what you do in a true academic sense, you just look at all the footnotes, look at all the citations, and then dive into papers, and then you end up with a library of, like I have 10,000 books, half of them unread because you just haven't got time. But that's, yeah, there is no particular source for that. You just, yeah, but Lincoln's a very good starting point. I'd recommend. In fact, I think it's got a paper out which is quite freely available on the creation myth. I think it's called, it might be actually call it the Indo-European myth of creation. And that's a really good place to start. And that will touch on Manu and Yimo, and probably align it to Amir and Yama and Yima. And so because you get those in India and Persia. And so you start seeing that flow through. And then I don't know who links it to Romulus and Remus, but there is, you know, Romulus and Remus is actually a direct analog. So, you know, Romulus and Remus are twins, much like Manu and Yimo, and they suckle on a wolf rather than a cow, and they create Rome rather than the world. But it's just a complete analogy. You just see it all over.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, then we can put links down in the description below for anyone who want to read this, because it's really fascinating stuff, and people are always curious about the sources on that. So it's yeah, it's what you would expect. There's not much. There's not a main written text from that time, but there's lots of great academics doing the reconstructions, and that's
but that's why I do YouTube, exactly why I do my channel, because I know people don't always or can't be bothered to read, and some of the texts are really difficult to get hold of, incredibly challenging. So I've, you know, in effect given you a synopsis of what they say, and I try and be I'll try to be unbiased and academic in my viewpoint all the time.
That's good. Yeah, I can go on asking questions all day, but to stay on topic, we can. Yeah, Garrett, you can ask some more of your scheduled questions. Keep it on subject.
This actually is unscheduled, but are there any physical things too that help like connect some of these myths together?
Yeah, like archaeological finds or paintings, things like that.
Yeah, paintings, or like even like an evolution in certain symbols that we would see in Norse mythos.
So we've got a couple of things. So one is around who Odin is, because there's often questions about that. So when Tacitus writes about, is it Zeus Maximus? I think he calls him the main god of the Germanic tribes, and we assume that is Odin because of Woden's Day. There is a inscription on a pillar we see about a god of ravens, I think it is, in Germany, to sort of suggest that because Odin is known to be associated with ravens, and so you assume Woden is associated with ravens, that gives you one link to suggest that's there, but that causes a whole heap of confusion about where Odin or Woden comes from, and we can talk about that in a minute. But one of the nice ones I see is there's a horn. I think I want to say Gallius, but it may not be called that. There were two horns, and there's some carvings on those horns or imagery. And one of those images shows a three-headed monster with some animals fighting, and I think it's holding an axe as well. And we believe that may well be an interpretation of Trito fighting the dragon. Like in fact, the main warrior fighting the dragon to get his cattle back, and that's because the dragon of old myth had 3 heads and 6 eyes. It's a 3-headed, and it sort of links to Trito being the third. But we have no words around that to say for sure.
Okay.
And we see other hints of mythology around Tyr losing his arm, and that's a common piece of myth. And we see brackets of with Tyrion with his arm lost, so we know there's links to that, and that's an important aspect. So why is Tyr losing his arm important in this? And this is to do with the king, okay, and this could lead to other conversations. So when Ymo is sacrificed to build the world, okay, and he's killed by Manu, and Ymo willingly sacrifices himself. Manu builds the world from Ymo's body, but then he builds man from the earth, and this is part of the cosmogony. So, and we see this actually in this is probably in the Prose Edda rather than the Volos poem, if I remember correctly. You see a description where the blood turns to sea, the bones turn to rock, his hair turns to grass. You get this cosmogony turn up. Now, when the cosmogony of the Indo-Europeans is that when you are born, you take parts of the earth for your body. So to be your body, you need stones to create your bones, and earth for your flesh, and water for your blood. So there's this cycle, and it's really important that's why you sacrifice to give back to the earth, so it never runs out of resources, so you can carry on being born. Okay, so what we see is that when the earth is made, Manu then has to create some people. And you see this sort of mythology all over the place. And so how he creates people is by using the earth, but he uses different parts of the earth for different people. Okay, so he uses the head, or the parts of the earth made from the head of Ymo, to make the king, make the priest, because the priest needs the brains and the aspect. He creates from the torso the warriors. So from the earth, and then from the legs of Ymo, he makes what he calls the producers, or the farmers, or the commoners. But the king, in effect, the person who in effect, the replacement of Ymo, because Ymo is considered the king, and he ends up being the king of the underworld when he's sacrificed, which is a different myth. The king is made up of all those parts. So he takes a part from Ymo's leg and Ymo's body and Ymo's head, puts that together, makes the king. And that's why the king is the king, because the king has part of him that understands the priest, understands the warrior, understands the commoner. And it also makes the king one with the land, and the land one with the king. And then we see a common motif in myth that if the king becomes injured or loses an arm, so we see this in Irish mythology, we see this with Tyr, although we don't necessarily have the mythology around it, but we see in stories of even King Arthur, that when the king becomes injured, the land dies. And when the king becomes injured, also, if he loses a part of his body, he's no longer fit to be king anymore, because he can no longer empathize with that part of society that part of the body was part of.
Is there any like common reason why they lose their arm? And it's bitten off by the wolf Tyr, but when binding him in the Norse, but That myth has always puzzled me. Don't know what it means, but is there any clues in the other ones as to why the king loses his arm?
It's I think it's something to do. One is part to do with the warrior, and you see injuries. So you see it in Beowulf as well. Like the dragon is attacked on the stomach, I think, and also Sigurd, the dragon he attacks, Fafnir, I think he's attacked underneath on the stomach. You see this torso is always tends to be the thing that gets injured in king type rituals, and there tends to be a reward for that as well that you get back. And I think it's part to do with that motif of if you lose or you injure someone with that part of the body, you get a particular reward. And so therefore, if you lose that part of your body, you then get something removed. And then this may link certainly with Tyr to who is Tyr, because there's some thoughts about it, because Tyr's name can be considered the same as God. You know, Tyr is cognate with Zeus and therefore Dis, which is Indo-European for God. Some people think, oh, that means Tyr must have been a god like Zeus and therefore was the Sky Father, because that was Dis Pater. And there isn't a Sky Father type figure in the Nordic pantheon, not an direct equivalent. Although Odin is a chief god, it doesn't necessarily make him a sky god. I'd say Thor, if you had to pick out someone to be a sky god, Thor would probably be it. And he's probably been promoted from a storm god role, almost certainly. We could talk about that. But yeah, because you don't know who Tyr is, I think his rise or his fall and Odin's rise are correlated. That's my gut feeling. Can't prove it. But it just seems odd that Odin, who isn't mentioned anywhere, suddenly appears, and Tyr, who we haven't seen anywhere, suddenly appears with his arm gone. And I think that probably coincides with history being written and starting to be documented that we start seeing this. But it's hard to say. It's hard because you just haven't got the names in the pantheons to help all these lists together as well. So I don't know. It's a really interesting story, and I would love to know more. And I'd love to chat with you for an hour or two over a cup of tea to discuss that particularly. Just bounce ideas off each other to, see if I'm not missing something. But to me, that it just feels odd. People think Odin's been around for, I don't know how you feel, but to me, Odin's only been around a couple of thousand years, certainly in that form. Well, probably 1,500 years, maybe that form. He's been around longer in different forms I can talk about. And it just seems odd that it's come up then and Tyr has gone and the Roman Empire has expanded into Europe. All these things are happening. So yeah.
All right.
Did that answer your question, Gary? I don't know. I went off on one again. Sorry.
Answered with a little extra credit on top of that.
Berserker, you mean?
Yeah.
It's a popular, yeah. So you want to understand where the Berserker came from?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the Berserker means bare skin in Nordic, so we know. But what we find is actually the earliest representation we have of it, really well documented, is with Homer. And Homer talks about it, I think it's in the Iliad, I may be corrected on that, where he talks about Lysa. And he talks about people, well, and this is the thing, people have the Lysa. What he doesn't explain is whether they are possessed by Lysa or Lysa possesses them. And what Lysa means is it's like a rabid animalistic rage associated with horses, okay, and other animals, but it's not associated very specifically with wolves. And that's quite interesting, because the reason for that is that we see many warriors try to get this rage, but many still die. And the view is that the only people who can truly have this are people who were heroic in their stature anyway. Only that the legendary heroes could actually fully have this Lysa. And the reason is, or part of the conclusion, is that they act like wolves but aren't rabid, and that's because wolves themselves are naturally aggressive. They don't need to be ill or rabid to act rabid. They are rabid. And so that was the premise of it, and we see that in Homer, but we see links to this in Persian texts, we see links to it in in Roman and Greek texts. And so we also see this berserker form, which is almost certainly a follow-on from that. And what we also see as part of that, and we see this actually with the cattle raiding myth, where Trito fights the dragon and he makes a sacrifice. The sacrifice Trito makes is of soma, or of a drink, a libation. And you see this Vitra doing that to fight Indra in the Vedic texts. But you see this drink, I think called Kurga or something, Kurgon in Greek. But you see this drink being drunk as part of that process. And we see the mead of poetry, which I think is probably very analogous to this in the Nordic myths as well. So there is this drink that is consumed to give you some of that ability. And there's talk about, is that some kind of psychedelic or something going on there? And that's a more difficult conversation to have. I mean, I do think there was some access to psychedelics. I don't think it was a very common thing. I think it was well controlled, certainly in the last couple of thousand years. But that's where I think that comes from, the consumption of a drink to put you in a frame of mind that gives you this rage.
What type of times do we start to see those things disappear? Of course, this rage-like warrior kind of faded out in all cultures, the Norse too, and I know the Romans too, and the Greeks. It was valued at one point, and then it kind of, they were thought of as not a beneficial thing after a certain time. As that's it's just a development of society, something that happens from what you've seen.
It comes along with, you call it the development of society, you could call it influence from religious movements from the Near East, you could call it the rise of Christianity and Abrahamic religions. So all those push back against that. I mean, it was already probably gone to a degree in Greece by the time that was happening. It was certainly alive and well, though, in Scandinavia. I mean, Scandinavia wouldn't have gone till 1,000 years ago. In Greece, it went probably 2,000 years ago. So yeah, and that's partly because of thinking and culture. There's no one thing, but do not underestimate the influence Christianity had on stopping some of these things.
Yeah. They made it illegal first.
Well, they made many
Norse.
things illegal. Yeah, they outlawed many things.
Many spiritual things illegal. That's a long subject for another video too.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. It's very. Yeah, I become quite flippant when talking about Christianity sometimes, because it just the influence it had was incredible and very negative to those cultures.
The weaponization of it.
Yeah, well, just the ignorance people had. They destroyed many writings just so they could write Christian texts on, scientific papers and math papers and the like. Just, we would knock back 1,000 years at least. On top of the other aspects of culture that were lost.
Yeah, there's a number of things lost. I think it was like Giordano Bruno was hung upside down and burned at the stake because he suggested there could be other worlds with human-like life on it. It was 1300s.
Yeah, there's all sorts. I'll do loads of YouTube shorts about the church, just so people really understand how hypocritical it can be.
So what we spoke about earlier, why aren't there any sources on the Proto Indo-European mythology? That's why.
That's one of the reasons, absolutely. I mean, it was pre-writing, but even the writing stuff, to say much of that's been destroyed, certainly around Greek and Italy. And in North Africa, like Egyptian stuff and the Near East. There must have been some amazing stuff in the Near East that's now been lost. And I was speaking to a chap called Richard Carrier, who's a mythicist, I think it's called. So he doesn't believe Jesus Christ was real. And I've got to agree to him, I think, in an extent. And I was talking to him about what does the Vatican hold that would be a big secret. And his answer was, if there's anything in there that was a big secret, the Vatican would have destroyed it years ago.
They've destroyed so much, of course, over the thousands of years. But what do you think made them? They could have destroyed anything they wanted, right? Anything about the Greek mythology or the Roman or the Egyptian or the Norse, and they successfully did this in a lot of places. But what do you think out of the ones that remain that they didn't want to destroy? Why do you have any ideas as to why those specifically may have been allowed to just not be burned, basically,
but not
and why we still
destroyed?
have
Yeah,
those today?
because I feel they didn't think they were such a threat. I mean, it's hard, whilst we still see examples. Let's say if you go to Rome today, you'll still see examples of some pagan worship, but it's far less. I mean, if you went back to the time that, let's say, 1800 years ago, there would have been probably thousands of times more. So they have destroyed loads. It's just, relative to other places, there's lots, but actually relative to how much there was, there's literally nothing. So I think they did a good job at destroying and burying much of it. Why? Because I just don't think they think it's a threat. I mean, look at Snorri Sturluson in Iceland, quite happy to teach his, admittedly is aggregated and manipulated to fit a particular desire he had. But when he wrote the Prose Edda, he still wasn't afraid to tell some of the poetry. I mean, there is stuff in there that is obviously made up as a Christian conversion tool, but some of it isn't. And he obviously felt that wasn't a problem.
Yeah. And then you have the Poetic Edda, which was actually hidden away for 400 years, written around the same time, but then it popped up on a farm in the 1600s because they knew that one would probably be destroyed. And even then, a couple pages were torn out of it that we don't know of now. So
and even then, I think some of it has been changed, or not exactly as it was originally written. I mean, because whilst it's poetry, the reason why the Poetic Edda is a good source for anybody watching is because it is poetry, and theoretically it's harder to edit a poem than it is just to edit prose, because you'll notice if something doesn't rhyme, not that you add a different meter, but think of that at a basis. If you had a poem, the cat sat on the hat, and it changed to the cat sat on a dog, you'll know something's wrong there. And so, and we do see examples of that in the Poetic Edda on some of the poems, especially in the Volaspor. There's a number of changes, and even though we've got a couple of different examples of that poem, they've been both have oddities in the same place, so you can't tell which is actually right or not, especially towards the end. So it's and if you think, actually, if Snorri understood how the poetry was written, then you can't put it past him to others to have known how to write it and therefore make the change to the poem so it would still fit, but maybe get rid of something exceptionally controversial.
So while I have you both here, I do want to ask, what are your theories or research on what you think those missing pages were?
Can't be sure.
You can't be sure. I mean,
it was probably the most important thing in there. If they felt the need to tear them out, it's probably something that makes sense of it all. And this was in the 1600s, by the way, so we were far away from the church, gathering up all the books and burning them like they did a few hundred years ago. But still, there was something that's dangerous in there. They thought that they needed to get rid of it.
Yeah, I mean, it was height of the witch hunts at that sort of time. So, there could have been some magical poem. There are hints of these things in the Prose Edda. I mean, Snorri alludes to poems that we don't have copies of. So, but I mean, the poems are so good in the Poetic Edda. They're really, even if you're not interested in Norse religion, just to read the poems for their mythology is really interesting.
Before we finish, I want to make sure I don't forget this before we finish the podcast, but it is going to be a lot of practicing pagans watching this. Is there anything, we've spoken about the mythology so far, but is there anything like common that you would find in the religious practice in all the Indo-European religions? Is it the sacrifices that they all share in common? Is it some sort of agricultural practice? Is it certain types of magic or ritual that we basically all had in common?
Yeah, so there's a few things. So I don't consider myself religious, and I get offended by the term pagan, though. I consider it a traditional religion. I think pagan is a Christian calling us a derogatory term. But I do believe there's a call me a romantic, there's an aspect of the culture that if we could adopt, life would be better. So in terms of religious belief and practice, though, understanding the cosmogony of you should give back to the world what you take, I think is very important. I also think that the telling of these stories, these poems, is sort of misunderstood. So mustn't forget, books weren't around when these poems were told. They were told by a person, and very often the poems in the Prose Edda, many of them were told in a ritualistic manner, almost like a monologue of a play. There was someone there acting out, Grimnir Small, you can imagine a man with a mask and taking it off and in the halls. And if only we could tell stories like that again, there may be a better understanding of what they meant. You may feel that better. But finally, I think one of the key things that I really admire of the Indo-Europeans is there's a poetic term they use, and it's translated as "fame does not decay." And to me, that tells you should live your life and to its fullest, such that people will write poems about you and sing and tell those poems forevermore. Because the view is that you don't die when you die. You die, but no one else speaks your name.
Yep. Yeah. So that's a cognate thing then in all the Indo-European type mythologies.
Yeah, they have that
for
links
sure. The
in
Norse.
there.
Yeah. How about I like what you said about the imitating their gods in the myths, and either by acting it out in some sort of play form that they would have done in like ancient Greece, or even certain rituals at certain times of year. They did this. We know pretty clear records actually that the Romans did this, basically like imitating their gods, and some good signs the Norse did this too.
Absolutely. I mean, people. So the Norse gods weren't like the Greek or Roman gods. People sometimes think, oh, Thor is the god of thunder and stuff like that. This is really not the case. Thor, gods were people you admired and you wanted. They were like your heroes. They were people. If you needed to be a warrior, you would want to be as good as Thor. You want to be like Thor. That's how I see it. You don't have faith in him. You don't pray to him unless you need him. Unless you're going into battle, then he is. You think of him in your head. It's almost like the light thing of being a wolf. You think you want to be part of Thor, and part of Thor is in you. That's your sacrifice. If you sacrifice something, Thor would put strength in you, and you'll go off to battle. To me, that's what it was about. That, and that's how you were close to the gods in that aspect.
Yep. Very interesting. So if people taking away any type of religious practice from this, and as I speak about in my channels all the time, it's that a lot of the things we read about in the myths are ways to practice the religion too. It's certain ways we can imitate what they do for whatever purpose you want, whether it be good harvest or good in battle and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other things, Garrett?
No, just thank you for coming on, John.
No, that's well. Hopefully you enjoyed that. I know I talked a lot and I went off topic about 85 times, but
I love hearing you guys talk. That's why we're doing this podcast.